Story 1, Medieval Intimacy Unveiled. Chapter 1, No Privacy, No Problem. Hey, everybody! Welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're diving into something spicy, a little wild, and totally fascinating. The crazy, complicated world of medieval intimacy. Think knights, castles, and some seriously creative ways to steal a moment. Before we get rolling, hit that like button if you're ready for a history lesson that's anything but dull. And subscribe if you want more deep dives like this. Oh, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing who's joining us from all over the world. Now, grab a snack, maybe dim the lights, and let's step into the Middle Ages together. All right, let's kick things off by smashing the biggest myth about medieval romance. You're probably picturing candlelit bedrooms, silk sheets, and a lute strumming softly in the corner. Nope, that's pure Hollywood fantasy. Most folks back then lived in tiny, one-room homes where the whole family, kids, grandparents, maybe a grumpy goat, or a sassy chicken shared the same space. Privacy didn't exist. Your kitchen, bedroom, and barn were basically the same spot, just with different smells. If a couple wanted some alone time, they had to get sneaky. Was it late enough? Were the kids asleep? Was the cow distracted? You had to make it work. Curtains were for the rich, and beds were often just straw piles shared by everyone. Even in fancy, noble houses, servants might be snoozing at the bed's foot or standing in a corner, acting like they didn't hear a thing. Some households kept logs of who slept where, which is as awkward as it sounds. Traveling, good luck. Inns back then were like medieval Airbnbs gone wrong. Strangers could end up sharing your bed. Imagine trying to get romantic while some guy in muddy boots snores next to you. Not exactly a mood setter. If you were married, you might snag a quiet moment on a semi-clean mattress if everyone else was out or asleep. But if you weren't married, you had to be ninja-level quiet. Villages were small, walls were thin, and gossip spread faster than a cold. One slip-up, and the whole town was whispering about you. For monks and nuns, the rules were ironclad. No privacy, no distractions, just a big fat nope to anything romantic. But human nature's stubborn, and some monasteries had suspiciously tall garden walls. If you know what I mean. Now, let's talk about the church, because they had opinions about what went on behind those shared curtains or lack thereof. Their rule was simple. Intimacy was for making babies. Period. Not for fun, not for bonding, just for population growth. Anything else was a distraction at best, a sin at worst. They had a whole calendar of no-go days. Sundays, off limits. It's the Lord's Day. Fridays, nope, that's for penance. Lent, forget it, 40 days of nothing. Advent, another 40, add in feast days, fast days, and weird moon phases. And you were lucky to have a random Tuesday in May to work with. The church didn't just control when, they had rules for how. Missionary was the only approved style. seen as natural and least likely to tick off God. Anything else, like getting too excited, was a red flag. One 13th century manual told couples to keep it quick, modest, and joyless, which sounds like the least romantic playbook ever. Priests got nosy, too, asking super specific questions during confession to sniff out rule breakers. Imagine confessing to a friar who knows more about your love life than your partner. Cringe city. But here's the deal. Not everyone played by the church's rules. In strict towns, you might get a fine or a lecture. But in others, priests just shrugged. Peasants, especially, were practical. They'd nod at the sermon, then go home and do what felt right, as long as the neighbors didn't hear. Planning a romantic night was like a heist you needed timing. A priest's? Okay. And a bit of luck. It wasn't easy, but medieval folks made it happen, one hushed moment at a time. Let's wrap this chapter with a reality check. Medieval intimacy wasn't about grand gestures or fairy tale vibes. It was about finding connection in a world where privacy was a myth, and the church was always watching. But people still stole glances, shared whispers, and made it work. In the next chapter, we'll dig into the church's obsession with controlling love and how folks pushed back. Stick around. It's about to get even spicier. Story 1. Medieval Intimacy Unveiled. Chapter 2. Church Rules. Rebel Hearts. Hey, friends. Welcome back to our deep dive into medieval intimacy. If you're just joining us, go check out Chapter 1. We talked about how privacy was basically non-existent and couples had to get creative. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment with your location and time. All right, let's pick up where we left off and explore the church's iron grip on medieval love lives and how people sneaked around those rules like total rebels. The medieval church wasn't just a spiritual guide, it was the ultimate romance police. They had a rule for every detail of your love life, and they weren't shy about enforcing it. Intimacy was supposed to be all about making babies, no fun, no bonding, just the bare minimum to keep the population growing. Anything else? Straight to the sin bin. They had a calendar packed with forbidden days. Sundays were a no-go, because it was God's day. Fridays were for penance, so hands off. Wednesdays, shady for some reason. Then you had Lent, Advent, Saints' feast days, fast days, and even certain moon phases. By the time you crossed off all the off-limits days, you were left with maybe a Thursday in June, if you were lucky. And it wasn't just about when. You could get close. It was how. The church was obsessed with keeping things proper. Missionary was the gold standard. Not just tradition, but a symbol of order. Anything else, like showing a bit too much enthusiasm, was suspicious. One 13th century bishop wrote that couples should approach intimacy without pleasure, without sin, and without delay. Talk about a vibe killer. Priests got super nosy during confession, asking questions that were way too personal. Was it on a holy day? Did you enjoy it? No wonder people dreaded those chats. The church didn't stop at married folks. If you were single and sneaking around, you had to be extra careful. Villages were gossip central, and one wrong move could make you the talk of the town. You might get a fine, a public scolding, or a very pointed sermon from the priest. Nobles had it worse in some ways. Chaplains and confessors were always watching, ready to report any slip-ups. Peasants, though, had a bit more leeway. They were too busy with crops and livestock to sweat every rule. They'd smile, nod, and then do what they wanted, as quietly as possible. Now, let's talk about how people fought back. Because medieval folks weren't robots. They had feelings, desires, and a knack for finding loopholes. In some villages, couples used betrothal as a workaround, kind of like an engagement, but with more wiggle room. It let them act like a couple without the church flipping out. Others just took their chances, stealing moments in barns or by the river, hoping nobody was spying. The church tried to clamp down with lists, literal lists of forbidden days, marking half the year as off-limits. If you got caught being affectionate during Lent, you might face a lecture or extra penance. One bishop scolded a couple for getting cozy more than once a month, telling them to pray instead. Spoiler, they weren't thrilled, but enforcement was hit or miss. Some priests were sticklers, others didn't care, and many villagers just shrugged and carried on. For the rich, romance was more about strategy than love. Marriages were like business deals, sealing alliances or settling disputes over who owned which sheep. Courtship was a public affair, with chaperones everywhere. A noblewoman might have her mom or a stern aunt watching her every move. Holding hands, scandalous. But even in this rigid setup, people found ways to flirt, secret notes, coded songs, or a quick chat by the castle. Well, it was like sliding into someone's DMs. Medieval style. Let's debunk a famous myth. Chastity belts. You've seen them in movies or tacky museum shops. Right. Those clunky metal contraptions supposedly locked around a woman's waist while her husband was off at war. Truth is, there's no solid proof they were used in the Middle Ages. Most chastity belts we know are from later eras, often made as jokes or curiosities. Medieval records don't mention them, and honestly, they're wildly impractical. Imagine medieval hygiene. Then add a rusty lock. Yikes! Fidelity was enforced through simpler means. Chaperones, gossip, and the threat of a trashed reputation. So, what's the vibe? The church tried to micromanage every part of medieval intimacy, from timing to technique. But people found ways to bend the rules, sneak around, and steal moments of connection, even if it meant risking a sermon or a side-eye. In the next chapter, we'll dive into how love and courtship worked in a world where marriage was more about land than feelings. Stay tuned! It's about to get juicy. Story 1. Medieval Intimacy Unveiled. Chapter 3. Love, Land, and Loopholes. Hey, King! We're back for the final chapter of our dive into medieval intimacy. If you've been with us, you know how hard it was to find privacy and dodge the church's rules. If you're just jumping in, welcome. Go catch up on the first 2 chapters for the full scoop. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Let's wrap up this story by exploring how love and courtship played out in a world where Marriage was more about cows than cuddles, and how people found loopholes for love. In the Middle Ages, romance wasn't about candlelit dates or love letters. For most folks, it was a practical deal, like signing a contract with a side of livestock. Marriage was the ultimate business move. Families used it to grab land, forge alliances, or settle feuds over whose pig ate whose crops. A bride might bring a dowry of coins, linens, or a scrap of farmland. The groom's family might promise to chill out in return. Love, nice if it happened, but not the main goal. It was like medieval DLC cool if you unlocked it, but not part of the base package. For peasants, courtship was straightforward, but still watched like a hawk. A guy's worth was judged by his land, tools, or how beefy his ox was. A woman was sized up by her housekeeping skills, reputation, and whether she could avoid market drama. If a couple clicked, they might flirt at village dances or while working the fields. But someone was always watching a parent, a nosy neighbor, or the town gossip who lived for tea. If things got serious, families stepped in to haggle. Love could grow after the wedding, but it wasn't the starting point. Nobles had it tougher in some ways. Their marriages were like chess plays, planned by parents or lords to secure power or peace. A daughter might be promised to a rival son to end a fight, and feelings weren't part of the deal. One medieval saying nailed it. Better a rich match with a sour face than a poor one with a smile. Super romantic. Right. Courtship was a public spectacle. Young nobles rarely got alone time, with chaperones like Mom or a grumpy aunt on patrol. But even in this rigid world, people sparked a secret glance at a feast, a flirty tune, or a stolen moment during a hunt. These were medieval heart emojis. Now, let's talk risks. Sneaking a kiss behind the barn could land you in hot water public penance, a fine, or a dad with a pitchfork. For unmarried couples, things got dicey if their fling led to a pregnancy. Villages kept moral rolls, like shame spreadsheets, and getting caught could mean a church court date. Fines varied first offense, pregnancy, or, if you got hitched later, tying the knot could erase the fine like a medieval my bad pass. Handfasting, a sort of unofficial engagement, was another loophole, letting couples live together without full marriage. Though the church later tried to shut that down, virginity was a big deal, especially for women. Peasants expected it, but it wasn't always a deal breaker. A bride who wasn't pure might face gossip or a small fine. But life moved on. For noble women, though, virginity was a political weapon tied to inheritance, alliances, and family honor. A scandal could spark a feud or ruin years of planning. Some places had gross traditions, like showing a blood-stained sheet post-wedding to prove virginity. No sheet. Cue lawsuits, annulments, or drama that'd make reality TV jealous. Men, total free pass. Nobody cared about their past. Despite the rules, love still bloomed. People eloped, defied arranged matches, or snuck off for moonlit, chats. Troubadour songs glorified pining for someone unattainable, full of dramatic flair. These weren't just stories. They were dreams in a practical world. Real couples sometimes married for love, even if it meant less land or angry parents. Spousal letters from the time show real affection, and widows often remarried for companionship, picking someone they liked. Here's a twist. Some towns didn't just tolerate brothels, they ran them like businesses. Urban centers licensed them, taxed them, and set up red light districts. It was seen as a way to curb worse sins, like adultery or gasp dancing. The church grumbled, but often looked the other way, especially when they got rent from those buildings. Brothel work wasn't glamorous, but for some women, it was a choice for survival. Customers, everyone from knights to monks, paying with coins or eggs. Not exactly Tinder, but it worked. So, that's the medieval intimacy scoop. Less romance, more strategy. But with room for love, if you played it smart. That's it for Story 1. Up next, we are tackling medieval hygiene and how it shaped relationships. Stay tuned. It's gonna get funky. Story 2, Medieval Hygiene and Heartbeats. Chapter 1, Love in a Low Bath World. Hey, everyone! Welcome back to the channel! We just unpacked the wild world of medieval intimacy. And now, we're diving into something equally messy. How hygiene, or the lack of it, shaped romance in the Middle Ages. Picture muddy boots, rare baths, and love that didn't care about the smell. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment with your location and time. Let's get cozy and jump into a world where cleanliness was a luxury, but hearts still raced. Imagine you're in a medieval village, trying to woo your crush. You've got your best tunic on, only slightly patched, and you're hoping to impress at the market. Problem is, hygiene wasn't a daily thing back then. Bathing was more like a special event than a routine. And deodorant, not invented yet. Medieval folks weren't filthy on purpose. They were busy dodging plagues, fixing roofs, and chasing runaway pigs. Cleanliness was on the list. But way below, don't starve. Let's break it down. Most peasants bathed maybe once a month, sometimes less, unless they tripped into a stream. Soap was a big deal. Homemade from fat or imported for the rich. Public bathhouses popped up in towns, but they weren't always open. Plague scares or moral panics could shut them down fast. If you were wealthy, you might get a hot bath with herbs, scrubbed by servants. If you were poor, you got a cold bucket and a prayer. Nobody smelled you over the horse stable. Water itself was sometimes dodgy. Some thought too much bathing could make you sick, letting diseases sneak through your skin. Others just didn't have the time or a tub. Hauling water, cheating it, and finding space while geese fought over the yard. No thanks. So, people got crafty rubbing skin with cloths, chewing mint for breath, or splashing rose water if they were fancy. The elite had perfumes, but for most, your scent was a mix of sweat, wool, and whatever you stepped in. Now, picture flirting in this setup. You're at a village dance, eyeing someone cute, but everyone smells like hay and hard work. Kissing was a gamble. Dental care meant ash or herbs. If you were lucky, clothes didn't help, trapping heat and odors in layers of linen, wool, and leather. And yet, people fell in love, maybe because everyone was equally ripe. it canceled out. Or maybe love was truly blind and nose blind. The church had thoughts, because of course they did. They preached modesty, meaning don't flaunt your body, clean or not. Bathhouses were tricky. Some clergy saw them as sin dens, especially if men and women bathed together. Some towns banned mixed bathing, others didn't care. Either way, the church cared more about your soul than your soap, so they didn't push cleanliness as a virtue. If anything, being too clean could look suspicious, like you were trying to tempt someone. Hygiene shaped romance in sneaky ways. A clean face or fresh hands were a flex, like showing up in a sharp fit today. Women were judged hard on grooming a tidy braid or clean apron screamed, "I've got it together," which was a green flag for suitors. Men had less pressure, but a guy who didn't reek of the pigsty had an edge. Small acts, like sharing a lavender sprig or a bucket of water, could be flirty in a world of grime. These were big moves. Bathhouses were more than cleanup spots. They were social hubs, like medieval bars, but steamier. In cities, people went to gossip, deal, or scope out crushes. You'd soak in a tub, chat about crops, and maybe lock eyes across the steam, but bathhouses could get wild crowded, noisy, and sometimes sketchy. Some doubled as brothels, which we'll hit later. For now, no, they were a rare chance to get clean and flirt, if you could handle the heat. So, what's the deal? Medieval hygiene was rough, but it didn't stop romance. People worked with what they had: herbs, quick rinses, or sheer confidence. In the next chapter, we'll explore how hygiene played into courtship and the quirky beauty standards of the time. Stay tuned, it's gonna get even smellier. Story 2, Medieval Hygiene and Heartbeats. Chapter 2, Beauty in the Grime. Hey, friends, we're back for round 2 of our story about medieval hygiene and how it tangled with romance. Last time, we covered how baths were rare and people still managed to flirt, despite the, aromas. If you missed that, go check it out. It's a stinky setup for tonight's chat. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Let's dive into the wild world of medieval beauty standards and how hygiene shaped who was a catch in the village. So, you're a medieval villager trying to win over your crush. What's your move? It wasn't about chiseled abs or a perfect skincare routine. Beauty back then was practical, tied to health, status, and how well you could rock a cleanish tunic. Hygiene was a big part of that, but clean was relative. Nobody had toothpaste or body spray, so standing out meant small efforts: a freshly washed face, combed hair, or hands that didn't scream. "I wrestled a goat" could make you the talk of the town. Women faced more pressure. Medieval beauty standards loved modesty and tidiness. Clear skin, no dirt or sores, was a must. Long hair, neatly braided or tucked under a cap, showed you had your act together. Pale skin was a flex for noble women, since it meant you weren't toiling in the sun. Peasant women, stuck in fields, might rub herbs or chalk on their faces to fake that glow. But it was a hassle. A clean apron or mended dress was huge. It signaled skill and respectability. Basically medieval catnip for suitors. Men had it easier, naturally. A guy didn't need to be a dreamboat to score points. If he had land, a solid plow, or didn't start bar fights, he was golden. Hygiene-wise, a trimmed beard or hair that wasn't a bird's nest helped. Nobles might splurge on scented oils or fancy soap to smell like money. But peasants just aimed not to smell like the barn. Some guys chewed cloves or fennel seeds for breath. The closest thing to a medieval dating hack. The church, predictably, had opinions on beauty. Vanity was a sin. So looking too good could get you in trouble. Women who fussed over their looks, like dyeing hair with walnut shells or pinching cheeks for blush, risked a lecture about tempting men. The church wanted you focused on heaven, not hair care, but people ignored that. Noble ladies used rose water or milk baths for soft skin, while peasant women tried rainwater washes or mint-rubbed hands. Bathhouses were the ultimate beauty flex. In towns, they were like medieval spas where you could scrub up and show off. Wealthy folks arrived with servants toting oils or combs, turning a bath into a status symbol. For regular folks, a bathhouse trip was a treat. Like a date night and clean up in one, you'd wash, maybe flirt, and leave, feeling like a new person, even if new just meant less dusty. Hygiene wasn't just about looks, it was a health signal. A cleanish partner was less likely to pass on disease, which was a big deal in plague-prone times. If you looked like you'd survive the next outbreak, you were prime marriage material. Bad hygiene, though, deal breaker. A suitor who smelled like a ditch or had teeth screaming, "I eat ash," wasn't winning hearts. It wasn't shallow. It was survival. A healthy spouse meant a shot at a healthy family. Courtship was a hygiene minefield. Markets, dances, or church festivals were flirt central. But you had to bring your A game. A clean tunic or a flower in your hair could seal the deal. Gifts were big. Offering lavender or a polished stone was like texting a heart emoji. But you had to be careful. Lingering too long by a stall could spark gossip. And if the village busybody caught on, you'd be dodging shade for weeks. Let's debunk a myth. Medieval makeup didn't exist. Wrong. Nobles used plant dyes or minerals for a subtle glow, like beet juice on lips. Peasants kept it basic, maybe smearing fat with herbs for lip balm. It wasn't about glamour. It was about looking alive and marriageable. The church wasn't thrilled, seeing makeup as a vanity trap. But women did it anyway. Zoo, who's got time for a sermon when you're trying to land a keeper? So, medieval beauty was about practicality over perfection. A clean face, tidy clothes, and a vibe that said, "I won't give you the plague," made you a catch. In the next chapter, we'll dive into how hygiene shaped intimacy itself, from awkward kisses to bathhouse hookups. Stay tuned. It's gonna get steamy. Story 2, Medieval Hygiene and Heartbeats. Chapter 3, Kisses, Odors, and Bathhouse Sparks. Hey, everybody. We're wrapping up our story about medieval hygiene and its role in romance. So far, we've tackled rare baths and quirky beauty standards. If you missed those chapters, go check them out. They're packed with juicy details. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Let's dive into the final piece, how hygiene shaped intimacy, from awkward first kisses to the steamy world of bathhouse flirtations. Picture this. You're a medieval couple, finally alone after dodging nosy neighbors and a very opinionated sheep. The stars are out, the mood's right. But there's a catch. Nobody's bathed in weeks. Intimacy wasn't a rose-scented dream. Bodies smelled like, well, bodies, mixed with wool, smoke, and last night's stew. Breath wasn't fresh. At best, you'd chewed some herbs. Skin was rough. Clothes were ripe. And yet, people got close. Medieval love was tough, shrugging off odors like a champ. Hygiene played a sneaky role in those moments. A quick rinse before a rendezvous was a power move, like bringing flowers today. If you could snag a river dip or a splash from the well, it showed effort. Women, especially, used cleanliness to stand out. A tidy appearance screamed marriage material. Upping their game for flings or forever. Men weren't judged as hard. But a guy who didn't smell like he slept with pigs had an edge. The church, as always, had rules. They preached modesty, even in private moments. Spending too much time grooming, like fussing with hair or using oils, could mark you as vain or lustful. But couples didn't care, especially behind closed doors. A dab of lavender or a cloth scrub could make a difference, even if just for one night. Hygiene also tied to health. A clean partner was a safer bet, which mattered when disease was everywhere. Bathhouses were the unsung heroes of intimacy. In cities, they weren't just for washing. They were like medieval clubs where flirting, gossip, and hookups happened. Imagine a steamy tub, folks laughing, and a lute player in the corner. Couples might visit together, using the bath as cover to get close without suspicion. Singles could scope out prospects, sharing a tub or a glance across the steam. It was risky but thrilling, like a date in a hot tub with the whole town watching. But bathhouses had a wild side. Some doubled as brothels, especially in shadier corners. Cities regulated them, taxing and licensing like legit businesses. They saw it as a way to control sin and keep bigger crimes, like assault, in check. The church wasn't happy, but often ignored it, especially when they pocketed rent. For some, bathhouses were a cleanup and flirt zone. For others, a job. Either way, they were where hygiene and intimacy crashed together. For better or worse, kissing was its own adventure. Bad breath was a hurdle, so people got creative. Mint, fennel, or cloves were go-to fixes. Wealthy folks used pricey spices for extra flair. Skin contact was another challenge. Layers of clothes trapped dirt and sweat. So undressing was like peeling a smelly onion. But medieval folks didn't let that stop them. A shared bath, a quick wipe, or just a we're both in this vibe made it work. Love wasn't about perfection, it was about connection. Grime and all, let's bust one last myth. Medieval people weren't always gross. They valued cleanliness when they could afford it. And they went all out to make intimacy special. A clean sheet, a sprig of herbs in the bed, or a rinse before a big moment showed care. In a world where survival ruled, these acts were like love notes, written in soap and effort. So, That's the story of medieval hygiene and romance, messy, real, and full of heart. People loved, flirted, and got close, even when baths were scarce and the church was lurking. That's it for story 2. Next up, we're diving into medieval contraception and family planning. Trust me, it's wilder than you think. See you in the next one. Story 3, Medieval Contraception and Choices. Chapter 1, Babies, Herbs, and Hopes. Hey, everyone! Welcome back to the channel. We've tackled medieval intimacy and hygiene, and now we're diving into something totally unexpected. How medieval folks handled contraception and family planning. It's a weird, wild ride full of herbs and oddball remedies. If you missed the earlier stories, go check them out. They set the stage perfectly. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment with your location and time. Let's jump into a world where birth control was part science, part superstition, and all hope. Let's get real. Medieval people knew how babies were made. They weren't clueless. They just lacked modern tech. Big families could strain resources, especially for peasants scraping by. So many couples wanted to space out kids or skip them entirely. It wasn't just about convenience. It was survival. Another mouth to feed could tip the scales. So they got creative with a mix of folk wisdom, herbal brews, and rituals that sound like wizard spells. The church, of course, wasn't a fan. They saw procreation as marriage's main gig. So anything dodging that was a sin, contraception got labeled unnatural, and priests would blast it from the pulpit. But that didn't stop folks. Married couples, especially poor ones, needed to manage family size. Unmarried folks had even bigger reasons to be careful. Nobody wanted a scandal or a forced wedding. So, despite the church's stink eye, contraception was a thing, even if it wasn't foolproof. What were the methods? Herbs were the MVPs. Women drank teas from rue, pennyroyal, or juniper, thought to prevent pregnancy. Some of these actually had mild effects, but they could be risky or toxic in big doses. Weirder stuff included wine boiled with beaver testicles or amulets blessed by a local healer. One guide suggested jumping up and down after intimacy to shake things out. No clue if it worked, but it probably gave you a workout. Barrier methods were around, too, but super basic. Women used linen cloths soaked in vinegar or herbs as makeshift spermicides. Others tried wax or animal membranes, early condom prototypes. These weren't reliable or factory-made, and let's not dwell on how they were crafted. The goal was to block or zap sperm, but it was more wishful thinking than science. Still, it shows people were trying, even without a lab. The church's disapproval made things dicey. Get caught using contraception, and you could face a fine, shaming, or extra confession time. Some priests were hardcore, others lax, and in rural spots, enforcement was spotty. Peasants had bigger fish to fry, like not freezing, so they'd nod at the rules and brew their tea in secret. Nobles had more at stake, since family planning could mess with inheritances. A noblewoman might use contraception quietly, with a trusted midwife's help. Midwives were the rock stars here. They didn't just deliver babies, they were women's health gurus. A good midwife knew which herbs might work, how to mix them, and when to stay hush. They passed knowledge down in whispers, often coded to avoid trouble. If a woman wanted to skip a pregnancy, she'd visit a midwife for a tonic or charm. And everyone got the hint. It was a delicate balance of survival and secrecy. Let's clear a myth. Medieval contraception was pure superstition. Nope. Some remedies like burying a weasel's foot were folklore, but others were based on observation. Plants like silphium were so effective, they got harvested to extinction. Healers built on centuries of trial and error, and some ideas weren't far from modern methods. So, medieval family planning was gutsy, hopeful, and a bit bonkers. Couples took risks, trusted midwives, and crossed their fingers, all while dodging the church's glare. In the next chapter, we'll see what happened when these methods flopped and how society handled unplanned pregnancies. Stay tuned! It's gonna get messy. Story 3. Medieval Contraception and Choices. Chapter 2. Oops! Now what? Hey, gang! We're back for Chapter 2 of our story about medieval contraception and family planning. Last time, we dove into the wild world of herbal teas and weird barriers. If you missed that, go check it out. It's a bizarre ride. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Tonight, we're tackling what happened when those methods failed, and how medieval folks dealt with unplanned pregnancies. Spoiler! It was a gossip-fueled roller coaster. Let's be honest. Medieval contraception was a gamble. Herbal brews, linen barriers, and post-intimacy hops weren't exactly reliable. When they flopped, couples faced a sticky situation, especially if they weren't married. An unplanned pregnancy wasn't just a personal oops. It was a village event. Small communities meant big mouths. And if a woman started showing or was spotted at the midwife's too often, the rumor mill went wild. Gossip was the medieval Twitter, and it could wreck your rep fast. For unmarried couples, the stakes were sky high. The church called premarital intimacy fornication, and they had a system for it. Local officials kept moral rolls. Think shame ledgers tracking who stepped out of line. If you got caught, you could end up in church court, facing fines, penance, or a public scolding. Fines depended on the situation. First offense, pregnancy, or if you got married later, tying the knot could wipe the slate clean, like a retroactive sorry. Pond fasting, that informal engagement, was a clutch move, letting couples claim they were betrothed to dodge the worst. In villages, practicality often won out. If a pregnancy popped up and the couple was serious, families would nudge or shove them toward marriage. A quick wedding smoothed things over, even if the baby arrived suspiciously early. But if the couple wasn't on board, or families clashed, it got messy. Gossip could make a woman's life hell, tanking her marriage prospects. A guy might face a brawl with her brothers or a fine if the church got involved. Either way, the village had a front row seat. Nobles had bigger problems. An unplanned pregnancy could derail alliances or inheritance plans. A noblewoman caught in a scandal might be shipped to a convent, rushed into a betrothal, or quietly sent away. Noble guys got off easier, but a fling with a powerful family's daughter could spark trouble. Virginity was a noblewoman's currency, tied to honor and deals. So a pregnancy out of wedlock was a crisis. Families might hush it up, but the stakes were feudal-level drama. Midwives were lifesavers here. 2. If a woman thought she was pregnant, she'd hit up a midwife for advice. Some knew herbs that could end early pregnancies, risky and hush-hush. But not rare, these were kept under wraps, shared only in trusted circles. If the pregnancy went on, midwives handled births and played mediator, calming families or softening church blowback. They were like medieval therapists, doctors, and diplomats in one. The church's stance was a mixed bag. They slammed premarital intimacy, but pushed marriage as a fix. If you wed, the sin was kinda forgiven, though you might still get side-eye at Mass. Abortion was trickier, called a sin. But early pregnancy was a gray area for some theologians. Herbal cycle starters were used discreetly, and midwives knew the drill. Hidden pregnancies might be passed off as miscarriages or sent to a relative's village to avoid drama. Let's bust a myth. Medieval folks didn't just shrug at big families. Kids were great, but not every couple wanted a dozen. Poverty, bad harvests, and illness made family planning a must, not a maybe. Unplanned pregnancies were tough, but society had fixes: marriage, hand fasting, or a quiet exit. It wasn't perfect, but it kept things moving. So, when contraception failed, medieval folks faced rumors, fines, and hard choices, but they found ways to cope. In the next chapter, we'll explore how the church and society tried to control family size and how people rebelled. Stay tuned. It's gonna get rebellious. Story 3. Medieval Contraception and Choices. Chapter 3. Defying the Divine Plan. Hey, everybody! We're wrapping up our story about medieval contraception and family planning. So far, we've covered quirky remedies and the drama of unplanned pregnancies. If you missed those chapters, go check them out. They're full of surprises. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Let's dive into the final piece: how the church and society tried to lock down family size, and how people quietly or loudly fought back. The medieval church was like a helicopter parent for your love life. Their big rule: intimacy equals babies. No exceptions. Contraception was a sin because it messed with God's plan for marriage. Priests would preach fire and brimstone, warning that dodging pregnancy could curse you with weak kids or divine wrath. Some even said it could tank your soul's VIP status in heaven. But medieval folks weren't always on board. They had crops to grow, mouths to feed, and not enough grain for a dozen kids. So they found ways to skirt the rules. The church's control went beyond sermons. In confession, priests might grill you about your bedroom habits, hunting for sin, using herbs, skipping holy days. Spill it. It was like a medieval polygraph, and you could end up with penance, fines, or public shaming if caught. In strict regions, couples faced church courts. explaining themselves to cranky clerics. But enforcement was patchy. Rural priests were often too busy or chill to care, and peasants took advantage, brewing their potions in secret. Society had its own pressures. Big families were a flex for the rich. More kids meant more heirs. For peasants, extra kids could help in the fields, but only if you could feed them. Tough times, bad harvests. Wars made another kid a burden, not a blessing. This pushed couples to get sneaky, even if it meant risking a lecture. Midwives were the MVPs, mixing brews and keeping secrets like pros. They were the underground network of medieval family planning. Now, let's talk rebellion. People weren't just nodding at the church's rules. They were finding cracks to slip through. One trick was timing. The church listed safe days for intimacy, but some couples flipped it, using forbidden days to avoid pregnancy, banking on lower odds of conception. It wasn't perfect, but it was clever. Others used coitus interruptus, which the church loathed but couldn't police. Risky, but it showed people were strategizing. Herbal contraception was a quiet revolt. Women visited midwives for teas or poultices, often under the guise of health tonics. These recipes were shared in whispers, coded to dodge suspicion. Some plants, like pennyroyal, had real effects, though side effects were no joke. In dire cases, women used herbs to end early pregnancies, a dangerous, secret practice. The church called it sin, but survival drove the choice, especially if a pregnancy threatened their lives or rep. Nobles rebelled, too. A noblewoman might use contraception to delay kids, protecting her health or avoiding a risky birth that could mess up an alliance. She'd do it discreetly, with a loyal midwife or servant. Noblemen sometimes encouraged mistresses to use contraception to avoid bastard heirs, stirring up inheritance drama. It wasn't romantic, but it was practical, keeping family feuds to a minimum. Let's debunk a myth. Medieval people weren't clueless about family planning. They tracked cycles, tested herbs, and learned from mistakes. Their methods weren't as slick as modern birth control, but they were rooted in centuries of know-how. Midwives were like scientists without lab coats. Refining recipes through trial and error, the church could preach all it wanted. But people took charge of their lives, one herb at a time. So, medieval family planning was a tug-of-war between rules and rebellion. The church tried to call the shots, but folks bent, broke, or ignored them, using herbs, timing, and grit to manage their families. That's it for Story 3. Next up, we're exploring same-sex relationships in the Middle Ages, a hidden, heartfelt twist. See you in the next one. Story 4. Medieval Same-Sex Stories. Chapter 1. Love in the Shadows. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. We've covered medieval intimacy, hygiene, and contraception, and now we're diving into something often overlooked. Same-sex relationships in the Middle Ages. It's a story full of heart, secrecy, and resilience. If you missed our earlier stories, go check them out. They're a great lead-in. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Let's step into a world where love found a way, even in the shadows. First off, Let's be clear. Same-sex attraction was totally a thing in medieval Europe. People have always loved who they love, no matter the century. But the Middle Ages wasn't exactly throwing pride parades. Society was built on strict rules, religion, marriage, property, and they all pointed to one model: a man and a woman wed to make more villagers. Anything else was officially a no-no. The church labeled same-sex intimacy a sin, tossing it in with other unnatural stuff, like dancing on feast days or reading too much. But real life, way messier than the rule book. The church's stance was loud. Same-sex relationships were forbidden, and punishments varied by place and time. A peasant couple might get a scolding or extra prayers. Nobles could face exile or a quiet cover-up if they had enough coin or clout. In harsher regions, fines or jail time were possible, especially later on. But enforcement was spotty. Some priests ignored it. Some towns looked the other way, and many folks just lived their truth as quietly as possible. The evidence is there if you dig. Medieval poems, letters, and legal records show emotional, romantic, and sometimes physical bonds between same-sex folks. Monks wrote Latin love letters to each other that sound more swoony than spiritual. Noble women shared beds and wrote devotionals that could double as wedding vows. These weren't labeled gay or lesbian. Those terms didn't exist. People just felt what they felt, often hiding it in poetry or coded stories to stay safe. Monasteries and convents were hotspots for these bonds. Put people in a single-sex space, sharing prayers and chores, and deep connections form. Monks might share a cell, trading notes or glances in the scriptorium. Nuns could pair up for tasks, building bonds that felt like partnerships. These were often framed as spiritual friendships, giving them cover. Who's gonna question two monks praying extra hard? But the passion in their words suggests more. And those tall garden walls weren't just for rabbits. Knightly brotherhoods were another gray area. Knights swore loyalty, shared tents, and wrote about each other in ways that sound super romantic today. Were they just bros? Maybe, but some poems read like love letters, full of devotion and longing. These bonds were public and praised. As long as they stayed friendly, it was a way to express love without tripping alarms. Let's bust a myth. Same-sex love wasn't invisible in the Middle Ages. It was hidden, coded, and carefully navigated. But it was there. People didn't have modern labels, but they had hearts, and they found ways to show it through songs, letters, or secret riverside chats. The church could preach all it wanted, but love doesn't follow a script. In the next chapter, we'll see how these relationships played out day to day and the risks folks took to be true. Stay tuned. It's gonna pull at your heartstrings. Story 4, Medieval Same-Sex Stories. Chapter 2, Secret Vows and Stolen Moments. Hey, friends! We're back for Chapter 2 of our story about same-sex relationships in the Middle Ages. Last time, we set the stage, showing how love thrived despite the church's rules. If you missed that, go check it out. It's a great intro. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Tonight, We're diving into how these relationships worked in daily life, from coded signals to the risks people took for love. Let's get into it. Living a same-sex relationship in medieval Europe was like walking a tightrope. You had to balance your heart with a world that wasn't always kind. The church might call it sin, but people carved out space for their feelings, doing it quietly, cleverly, and with serious courage. Most relationships stayed under wraps, hidden in coded letters, private moments, or friendships that looked innocent but meant the world to those involved. One big way people expressed love was through art. Troubadour songs weren't just for knights and ladies. Some poets wrote about same-sex devotion, using vague words to dodge trouble. A monk might pen a poem about his dear brother that feels like a love letter. Noble women wrote about their closest companion in ways that sound like vows. These weren't just pretty words. They were a safe way to shout what you couldn't say out loud. It was like tweeting a heart emoji, hoping your crush catches on. Monasteries and convents were prime spots for these bonds. Life in a single-sex space meant you were surrounded by folks sharing your world prayers. Chores, quiet nights. Naturally, some connections went beyond friendship. Monks might work side by side, swapping glances over manuscripts. Nuns could team up for tasks, forming bonds that felt like partnerships. These were often called special friendships, giving them a holy vibe. Who's questioning two nuns singing hymns together, but their letters full of longing, hint at more. Outside the cloister, it got trickier. In villages, same-sex couples had to be stealthy. Two women might live together as spinsters, sharing a home and life while passing as pals. Two men could call themselves brothers or comrades, working the same land. These setups let them build a life without too many raised eyebrows. Public affection like holding hands was rare. It could spark gossip or worse. Love happened in private, a shared meal, a well-side chat, or a moment in the fields. The risks were real. If a relationship got exposed, consequences depended on context. Some places gave you a warning or penance. Others, especially later, could slap fines, exile, or public shaming. Nobles had more protection cash, and status could hush things up. But peasants were vulnerable. A jealous neighbor or nosy priest could turn love into scandal. Yet people took the chance because love's worth it. Then and now, knightly bonds were a loophole. Chivalric culture celebrated men swearing loyalty, sharing battles and beds. These were seen as noble, but some went deeper. A knight might dedicate a victory to his brother in arms, and nobody blinked. It was a way to show devotion without crossing lines. Women had fewer outlets, but noble ladies formed tight friendships, sharing rooms and gifts that felt like courtship. Let's debunk a myth. Same-sex relationships weren't always harshly punished. The church had rules, but enforcement was inconsistent. Many communities ignored discreet couples, especially if they were useful, like a skilled baker or knight. Love wasn't always a crime. It was about not making waves. People lived authentically, even if it meant staying low-key. So, same-sex love was a quiet rebellion, woven into poems, letters, and stolen moments. People built lives together despite the risks. proving love doesn't need a spotlight. In the final chapter, we'll explore how these bonds shaped medieval culture and their lasting legacy. Stay tuned. It's a beautiful wrap-up. Story 4. Medieval Same-Sex Stories. Chapter 3. Legacy of Hidden Love. Hey, Ang! We're wrapping up our story about same-sex relationships in the Middle Ages. So far, we've explored how love bloomed despite strict rules, and how people lived it in secret. If you missed those chapters, go check them out. They're full of heart. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Let's dive into the final piece, how these relationships shaped medieval culture and the legacy they left behind. Same-sex love wasn't just a private thing. It left ripples in art, stories, and how people saw connection. The church wanted a black and white world, but reality was a rainbow of emotions and bonds that didn't fit their mold. These relationships, though often hidden, influence the tales we tell and how we think about love. Even centuries later, let's start with literature, where the traces are clearest. Troubadour poetry, those dreamy medieval songs, often played with same-sex devotion. Poets used coded language, like a monk praising his noble friend, or a lady dedicating verses to her dearest sister. These were safe ways to express love. Slipping past censors, knightly sagas about sworn brothers read like romances. Full of loyalty and sacrifice, they inspired later works, from Renaissance plays to modern love stories, showing love transcends time and rules. Monasteries and convents were cultural hubs. Too, monks' and nuns' letters weren't just personal, they were copied and studied. A monk's love note to another might end up in a library, shaping how scholars saw devotion. These texts blurred the line between platonic and romantic, giving people room to feel without breaking rules. The idea of friendship got a passionate twist, influencing how we talk about bonds today. Knightly culture left a mark. Sworn brotherhoods, men pledging their lives, were a medieval staple. Celebrated in songs, these carried into Renaissance ideals of male friendship and even modern buddy tales. Women's bonds were less recorded, but noble women's letters show deep devotion. These stories of loyalty, even coded, shaped how we see connection. From Shakespeare to rom-coms, the church, despite its rules, couldn't erase these bonds. Some rituals even echoed same-sex love, like brother-making ceremonies where men swore oaths in church, looking a lot like marriage. Historians debate if these were romantic, but the emotional weight was real. The church's own language of divine love, passionate, longing, gave people a way to frame their feelings, whether for God or each other. The risks remind us of the courage involved. Being open could mean gossip, exile, or worse, especially as penalties got harsher later on. Yet, people kept loving, finding allies, friends, kin, or kind priests who helped them stay safe. Some villages quietly accepted eccentric couples if they contributed, like a weaver or knight. It wasn't freedom, but it was survival, and it took guts. The legacy is subtle but powerful. These loves remind us that connection has always existed, even in tough times. Medieval poems and knightly vows carry echoes of real people who loved fiercely against the odds. Their stories fueled later movements, from Renaissance rediscoveries to modern equality fights. They showed love doesn't need permission, just a spark. Let's bust a final myth. Same-sex love wasn't erased from medieval history. It was hidden, coded, sometimes punished, but never silent. Poems, letters, and quiet lives kept it alive. And those traces linger in every tale of love that breaks the mold. So, that's the story of same-sex relationships in the Middle Ages. Courageous, creative, and enduring, these loves shaped culture in ways we're still uncovering, proving the heart always finds a way. That's it for Story 4 and our series. Thanks for joining me on this wild journey through medieval intimacy. Drop a comment with your thoughts and what topic you want next. Until then, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.